Blessings everyone, this is Reverend Aphren with the Four Pillars Proto-Temple. So this is the second video of Wiccan Ritualcraft. In the last video we talked about a lot of different things, from the understanding of ritual theory and practice. We also talked about how ritual is not a spectator sport. We also talked about how ritual, symbol, and myth work together and what that looks like, what that means. So at the end of the last video, I talked about creating a sacred space. And I talked about how this sacred space is reclaiming, in a way, the sacredness of the location, but it also is a way for us to sort of cut a space, in a liminal space, a space between the real world and the astral realms. So we create the sacred space and we begin to work on that. So at the end of the last video, I talked about how one might create holy water and sacred incense, and by combining water and salt to create holy water, by combining fire and incense to create holy or sacred incense, then we have the opportunity to go around the space and create those and create this holy space. Now, when we go around the space, we do so in a very prescribed way. So in the Correllian tradition, we use Scottish terms. So we use the term josel, which many of us, it's sometimes pronounced diosel or josel, is clockwise, also known as sunwise. So here in the northern hemisphere, the sun passes in a clockwise motion. So it is what is called josel. So it's in a clockwise motion. Counterclockwise, some traditions refer to it as widdershins. Some early Wiccan liturgy also refers to it as widdershins. It more correctly, in keeping with the same language, we refer to it as twathel, meaning counterclockwise or counter sunwise. So let's go back. Let's take a step back and talk and reference what I mentioned in the last video about symbol, myth, and ritual. The myth, or the understanding, is that the sun passes clockwise as it passes throughout the day. If you were to watch the sun as the sun moves in the sky, the sun is going from east to west, and as it's going from east to west, it's going in a clockwise direction or a sunwise direction. So as the sun is moving forward, time is moving forward, although we know time is cyclical, but we won't get into that. Time is moving forward. The day is progressing forward. The day is growing as the sun peaks at dawn, and as the sun goes to dusk, the day begins to move forward. The day is growing. The day is moving forward. So it has become associated that the sunwise or the josel movement is a movement of increase, a movement of invocation, a movement of bringing something in toward yourself. The opposite is also true. Going opposite of the sun would be like going opposite of the direction of the universe. We're undoing the day, maybe. We're going back in time. We're undoing the work that we've done because we're sort of erasing it. We're putting it on rewind. For those of you who are old enough to know what a VCR is, rewind. So the opposite of that, twathel, is counterclockwise. Counterclockwise is associated with pushing things away, of giving things away, of sending things away, of banishing instead of invoking. So that whole sort of pushing away is part of that. And there may be other reasons why Teotl have been associated with these things, but generally speaking, that is one of the reasons as to why these are associated. So, when you are in a ritual space and you are doing certain things in a ritual way, it is important to be mindful of the way that you are moving within the ritual space. So if we go back to creating this sacred space, we're using holy water and holy incense. The holy water is clearing away negativity. The sacred incense is raising the vibration, putting you into a spiritual mindset, and bringing you in to the mythic time. So with that being said, what directions do you think logically you might move to do certain things? Okay, I'll just tell you. If you are banishing, you would go counterclockwise. So as you stand before the altar, you pick up the holy water and you sprinkle the holy water around the space. And as you do that, you move in a counterclockwise direction. Because if we think about the symbol of counterclockwise or the symbol of clockwise and what they mean, then we're reminded of the mythical time when the sun is moving in this direction or in that direction and what that means in our lives. So we copy the sun with our ritual. We're moving counterclockwise. Counterclockwise is sending things away. We're sending away that negativity. And we're using the holy water, which I mentioned in the last segment of this video, as a cleansing and a grounding agent to send away that negativity. When we are using the incense, the sacred incense, we're moving clockwise. We're moving the opposite direction of banishing. We're moving the opposite direction of cleansing. We are moving in a direction of growth, a direction of invoking. And so as we move in this clockwise direction, we are invoking in the energies in, the positive energies in. When we're raising our vibrations, we're raising our consciousness to a higher level. This pattern is repeated again and again and again in the ritual. In some traditions and in some groups, they adhere so strictly to this Teotl process that once the circle has been cast and all of the preliminary ritual has been performed, and you get to the portion of the ritual where you're performing your magic or you're doing your worship, to move counterclockwise at that point would be a very big no-no. Because now you're working against the flow of the energy, and by doing that, you in some ways are undoing the energy. Some people adhere to that more than others. Me, I still try to be mindful. I don't live and die by it. I'm not going to have someone, seppuku kill me in the middle of the ritual because I went the wrong direction. But I try to adhere to that as much as possible because I'm in the mythic space, I'm in the mythic time, and I'm going to follow the rules of Ritualcraft, which is now we are invoking and we're creating this cone of power and we're doing all of our work to a goal. So I'm going to follow the rules. And I don't want to do anything that's going to jeopardize that. Some traditions are very strict with this, and we'll talk a little bit more when we get into other types of magical processes. So we do that. So after we have created our ritual space, and I should say created our sacred space, now it is time for us to claim this space as a ritual space. So for all intents and purposes, energetically, by this point, our ritual space has been cleansed, it has been charged, the vibrations have been raised, it is now at a level where it is a spiritual place. We can walk in and we can smell the incense, we can see the altar candles burning, and we can say, oh my goodness, I'm in a ritual space, or I'm about to be. So, at this point, we claim this space as being a sacred space for the time that we are using it. So our bedroom magically transforms into a ritual space, or our living room or whatever room we choose to use at this time is magically transformed into a ritual space. We are taking it out of the normal, everyday, mundane time, and we're transporting it to a place in between the worlds where we can perform our working, we can interact with the deities, we can do magic if necessary. We're moving ourselves into that time. Now, before we go any further, I want to talk about something else. I mentioned in the previous video that we were going to discuss tools once we got to that point, which is probably going to be in the third installation of this video. But tools are not always necessary. Very advanced practitioners can use their words and can use their visualization only to perform ritual. Excuse me. Now, most of us, that is not the case. And if you're like me, you just like to use tools. You just like to use things. You just like to have stuff in your ritual that anchors what you're doing. And that's all fine and dandy as well. If you feel that you don't need all of these tools, that is just fine. You may even decide, you know what, I don't need to use holy water and sacred incense to bless my space. I'm going to do it with my intention, with my will, and with visualization alone. And that's okay too, and that's also incredibly valid. I don't know of many people that do that, to be honest, but it's a viable practice. So, what words might you say? Do you need to speak in a different language? Do you need to speak in Latin? Do you need to speak in Hebrew or Arabic or some other language that someone perceived as being a sacred language? That is a choice that you need to make, and most of us would say no, you don't have to. English is just fine. Some people, myself included, have performed an entire ritual without saying a word because we're using our visualization, we're using the tools necessary, and we're using our minds and our intention and our focused will to complete the work that we're doing. So we don't even need to say words if you don't want to. So what words might you say then? Do you look up some book and say, oh my gosh, well, I gotta find the perfect words to say? No. In my temple, I've found that some people that are new to the craft always get really nervous when it comes time to having to do something that involves saying something. What do I say? How do I say it? What words do I mean? That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. What matters is your intent. What are you meaning to do? What are you trying to do? And whatever you're meaning to do, you need to just focus on that, and you need to put your full concentration on that. I am creating this holy water to be an instrument of blessing, to bless anything that it touches in this space as I use it. That is my intention. I'm going to play that intention. It's a phrase we use in theater a lot. I'm going to play that intention. I'm going to focus on that specifically, and that is my goal. No matter what happens, that's my goal. So speak words to that effect. It doesn't have to be some magical formula. It doesn't have to be some foreign language. It doesn't have to be some code. Excuse me. It can be words to that effect. If you are a ritualist and you're inclined to being very theatrical, like me, again with my degree in theater, let's be honest. I mean, what do you want from me? Then what are you gonna do? How are you gonna say those words? In our tradition, we bless the salt in the water, and then we put them together. And we have a certain formula that we say. But for you, what are you going to say? There are some tried and true methods. If you're interested in learning about them, you can look them up. There's many books on Wiccan ritual and Wiccan processes, like manuals almost. But I want you to understand that the words are not as important as your intention and your visualization. So when we visualize, we have the salt in our hands. If you see in my videos, we have the salt in our hands. We visualize negative energy being sent out of the salt. Then we invoke positive energy, and we send positive energy into the salt. And then we declare that salt to be holy. So the words that I use may be something like, through the agencies of the god and the goddess, do I hereby cleanse the salt of all impurities in the world and in the astral plane, and I ask that no negativity will reside within this salt. And then we would say, it's the second part to that, something like, and I do bless and charge and empower this element of earth to perform this working, so mote it be. So we have blessed the salt, we have charged the salt, and we've sent in positive divine energy. Now we turn to the water and we do the same thing, and we say a similar affirmation. Then we combine the two together, and if you want to say another affirmation at that point, that's fine too. You can say something like, through the agencies of the god and the goddess, may this water now be made whole and holy. Whatever. So we state these words, but these words are just vocalizations of our intent. We don't have to necessarily speak them if we can't or we don't want to. We can simply use our visualization, we can use our inner voice, we can use our magical voice. And for a long time I didn't know what magical voice was. Magical voice is, for a lot of people, their voices change when they're using magical voice. So you could be like, this water is totally holy right now. Or you could say, this water has been made whole and holy. Normally, for me, my magical voice is a little bit lower than my normal speaking voice. It's almost commanding, it's almost direct, it's very confident and very sure of itself. That's my magical voice. But your magical voice doesn't necessarily have to be verbalized. It can be silent. You can make that declaration silently in your mind, making that statement, setting that intention and saying, this is what's happening, now this is made whole and holy. That's it. No question about it. It is what it is, and that's just the way it is. And I'm not doubting it, I'm not questioning it, and I'm making it so. Excuse me. So, excuse me again. So, we set our intention, we speak our intention, we do our intention, we play our intention, okay? Excuse me again, I apologize. So, we've done that with our water and our incense, and we've created these sacred objects. We've blessed and charged the space, and now we're ready to claim this space as a sacred space. So in Wicca, how do we do that exactly? So for most traditions, when you create this sacred space, you do so using ritual tools. And we'll talk a little bit more about ritual tools later, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about them right now. But I think a lot about the practices, say, with the ancient Vikings. There is a lot of evidence, excuse me, as well as first-person written accounts about what the Vikings would do when they settled on a new piece of land. So they would settle on a new piece of land, and they would take a burning torch or some sort of burning fire that they could handle, and they would carry it around their space, basically claiming that space. I'm cutting this space out from the wilds of the world, and I'm domesticating this space for myself and my family. So hear me, Lanfetter, spirits of the land. I am creating and cutting out this place, domesticating it for myself, my family, my farm, my house, and this is what I'm doing. And to show you that, I'm going to do this thing, which was to carry around a burning brand of some sort. So for them, that was how they did that, but they wouldn't do it more than once. They would normally do it just one time. Once they've sort of claimed that land, that was it. So when I think about this, I think a lot about the idea of casting the circle. So as modern Wiccans, when we cast the circle, we take our ritual tool. In most traditions, it's the athame. Sometimes it's a wand. In larger gatherings, it might be a staff or a sword. And you take that around the space, and you physically, using the sword, you cut out a space for yourself and for the participants of the ritual. And by doing that, you are not only claiming the space as being a sacred space for this time, you are stepping out of the mundane world. You now have 1 foot in the mundane, 1 foot in the spiritual realm, and you're situating yourself at this bridge between the two. And excuse me again, this comes to us predominantly from ceremonial magic. Because again, as I mentioned in the previous video, most pagan traditions see the world as a magical place, see the world as a spiritual place already. And because it's already a spiritual place, there's no reason to cut anything out and separate anything out as being a sacred space or not. It's already sacred. But for us Wiccans, this practice comes down to us from ceremonial magic. So I'll explain a little bit about what that is. In traditional ceremonial magic, there are two areas that are used. There's normally a triangular area that is used, and there's a circular area. So in some traditions, as I understand it, the practitioner would stand in the triangular area, and they would cast a circle several feet from them, and they would use that circle as a way to contain a spirit being that was being summoned, being invoked. So whether it was an angel, or whether it was a demon, or whether it was an elemental or some other spiritual being, it was invoked into the circle. But the circle was acted as a vessel for that spirit. You're contained. You can't go anywhere. You can't step out of the circle. You're in this magical space, in this magical circle. You can't leave. And now, because I've got you trapped and I've got you chained, you have to listen to me. And I am going to command you through various rituals to do what I want you to do. So that's generally the premise. I've also heard in some forms of ceremonial magic, the triangle on the floor contains a spiritual mirror, which is then sometimes used by the practitioner sitting in the circle to view the mirror and be able to have communication, spiritual communications. So I am going to be completely honest, I am not an expert in ceremonial magic. These are things that I have studied, that has come to me from various things that I've studied. So I have heard different variations of that, but suffice to say, in one variation, this is how the circle is used. So that's come to us, this idea of the circle being a space of protection, this idea of the circle being a space of time in between time, this idea of the circle being a vessel or a container that is containing the magic that we are raising. So as we continue with our ritual and we're sending that energy and we're building that energy, it's staying put in this in this confined space until we're ready to sort of pop the balloon and let it go. So that's where it comes from. Now, not every Wiccan casts the circle every time. The circle is not necessarily always needed. The circle, for some people, is always needed. It just depends. I always cast the circle. So for us, the circle is a barrier. It's an area of protection, but it also places us again in that time in between time. So when we cast the circle, we're using our ritual tools, we're moving around the space. And if you remember from what I mentioned a moment ago about clockwise, counterclockwise, if you are, some traditions use the word closing the circle, meaning that you've drawn a line of a circle and you're bringing it back together again at the same point. You're closing it, you're drawing it to a close. So when you're closing the circle or casting the circle, you cast it in the same direction with the same understanding that I mentioned a moment ago. You are invoking the circle. You're bringing it in out of nothing. You're creating the circle. So you would do it in a geosal direction. Now, there's a caveat to this. You have to understand We talked earlier about the 4 elements, right? 5 elements if you count spirit. So each of the 4 directions is associated with an element. Each of the elements has a different energy, and we'll talk a little bit about that after the circle casting. But suffice to say, most people that I'm aware of, at the very least, always cast the circle in the direction of the east, because the direction of the east is the direction of new beginnings. Again, we'll talk about this a little bit later. So because it's the direction of new beginnings, when you are beginning to cast the circle, you cast it beginning in the east. So you face the direction of east, you use your magical tool, you move around the space in a very prescribed way, which we'll talk about later when we talk about ritual tools. You move around the space, and as you move around the space, you are creating a barrier. You are using your energies, your personal energy. You're sending that energy through the tool. That energy is going through the tool to an area upon the floor that you are designating as being the edge of your magical circle. And you move from east all the way around the space and back again to east. Some traditions will do it 3 times because, of course, in the read it says thread the circle thrice about to keep unwelcome spirits out. So you may do it 3 times, depending on how big the space is. It may take a while to go around 3 times, and you may have already said your invocation, so it's like, okay, now I'm just walking. But if you time it correctly, you can say your invocation at the same time, or incantation at the same time, and be able to complete 3 rounds or 1, depending on what it is that you choose to do. So we cast our magic circle. The circle, as I said, is a barrier. It acts as a container, all of that. So again, we go back to this idea of words. We go back to this idea of affirmations. Now I want to present to you a word, incantation. To incant is like to chant. So when you incant something, you speak it. So they talk about spells being like spoken. Incantations are always spoken. Okay, so when you incant something, you are speaking words. So I know it sounds very mystical and magical and sorcery, but I want you to understand that the word incantation means to speak, basically. So we have an incantation. Again, these words are not as important as the visualization, as the intent, as the intention. So we pass around our space and we make a declaration, an affirmation, an incantation. So based upon what I've told you about what the circle is meant to do, come up with your own incantation. Say what it is that you intend for this to do. Because not only by saying the words, when we say the words, we're hearing the words. When we hear the words, we're thinking the words. When we're thinking the words, we are in some ways subverting our mental process to do the thing. So we hear the words back to ourselves. So that's why I like to use words, because they're powerful, because we're hearing them back. So we set the intention, we speak the intention, and as we're speaking it, it's coming to happen. It's coming to be. It's coming to exist. We talk about the, in some forms of magic, in very old magic, I'm sure many of us have heard of the word abracadabra, right? Abracadabra means I create that I speak, or I create that which I speak. So abracadabra or avada kedavra is, of course, you may have heard it's the opposite of like the Harry Potter word avada kedavra. So abracadabra means I create that what I speak. So we are creating that what we're speaking, because we're using the intention, we're using our will, and as we're speaking it, we're creating it. So I hope you understand that, because that is the basis for a lot of what happens in Ritualcraft. So we take our wand or athame, our magical tool, and we cast circle, and we speak these words. So the words, again, can be up to you. But based upon what I said, and what the purpose of the circle is. Excuse me again. These are some of the words I might use. Here do I cast a magic circle, a circle to contain the power that I will raise, a circle of protection, and a circle of power. So mote it be. I just made that up. And you can too. You can use the words based upon your intention. I don't understand how difficult this is to explain to some people, especially people that are new. You're saying what you want to happen. That's all we're doing. We're using this incantation, which is a fancy word again for saying something, and we are saying what is going to happen. In the Dhammapada, which is part of the Pali Canon of Buddhism, the Buddha says, basically, we are, our world is a reflection of our perception. So if we perceive it to be as such, then it is as such. So, applying that principle to Ritualcraft, if we perceive this magic circle as being now a magic circle based upon all of the properties I mentioned and all the attributes that I mentioned, then it is. If we believe it to be so and we have the intention that it is so. But we always speak in the present. So when you're performing magic, you always speak in the present. This is happening, or this not necessarily is going to happen, but this has happened. This is presently has happened, or this is the way that it is. There's no question about that. Not I want it to happen, or maybe in the future it'll happen. No, it is happened. And I said that grammatically incorrect for a reason. It is happened. Not has happened. Anyway, I'm sure I've lectured you enough on that. So, understand that that is the way that it needs to be. For your casting of the circle. So now we have casted our circle. We've begun in the east, we've moved around, and we've casted our circle. So at this point in this lecture, between the first part and this present part, we have spoken about ritual theory, ritual practice. We have spoken about some where some portions of ritual come from. We've talked about creating sacred space by blessing and charging a space. And we've also talked about casting a magic circle. Stay tuned. In the next portion, we will be talking about calling the quarters and invoking the deities. So let's talk about calling the quarters. I have never heard of anyone say calling the corners, like corners. That's sort of a Hollywood thing. It's normally quarters because the circle is broken into fourths, so they're quarters. Or sometimes it's invoking the watchtowers, sometimes it's invoking the guardians, sometimes it's invoking the elementals. There's a number of names for this process. Now let's go back for just a moment to something I mentioned earlier in this series when I talked about the Norse myth of Ymir, his body being used to create the world and his cranium being used to create sort of the dome of heaven. And at each of the four corners are standing dwarves which are holding up the sky, basically. When you understand that myth and you see those symbols, when you speak of those symbols, you're recreating and you're being reminded of the myth. So for us Wiccans, when we invoke the elements, we are recreating the cosmos in that space, every ritual. I think that a lot of times certain people that may practice Wicca may find the preliminary practices in Ritualcraft as being trite or boring. Like, oh my gosh, what's the point of invoking the quarters and calling the gods? Can we just get to the magic now? Can we just get to the work? And okay, yeah, whatever. But we have to understand that there's a reason why we're calling the quarters. Like, we're not just saying fancy words and going through the motions. There's a reason why we're doing that. And the reason, one of the reasons, is because we are recreating the world in ritual. We are reenacting the myth through the symbols in our ritual. We are reenacting the myth of our understanding of cosmology and our understanding of our worldview by using the symbology of the elements and what they stand for, and creating a ritual that involves that. Okay? So when we go ahead and we cast the magic circle, we place ourselves in a time between times. We place ourselves in a liminal place. Some invocations or some incantations will say, I cut a space between the worlds, the world of men and the realm of the mighty spirits. That's exactly what we're doing when we cast the circle. So now we're in this mythical time. We're in this magical place between the worlds. Okay? Now, we're going to call in the spirits of each of the directions. And depending upon the tradition that you follow, may depend on what that looks like, what the spirit is, or what it is that they look like. So for some people that may be more ceremonial, they may be invoking a specific spirit, like an angel or a demon. Some people that are more shamanic might be invoking a type of mythical being, like the Thunderbird or something. Some people that are more traditional Wiccan might be invoking elementals in a way. You know, when you invoke the watchtower or the guardian of the watchtower of this direction, you are invoking sort of the essence of that direction. Now, let's put a pause on calling the quarters for a second and take a step back in time with me. I want you to come back in mythical time, to this mythical time when Europe was, maybe just after the Dark Ages, maybe in a time when there were wise men and wise women that would help villages, and they would use their cures and their herbalism and their magic to help the village. Take yourself back there. Think of people in huts and in cold, frigid England, or somewhere around there, and think about where these people are. They're in Northern Europe, where it's generally cold. However, further north it is icy. Further south it is warmer, and in the summertime it may even get to be pretty hot. To the west you have water, you have the Atlantic Ocean. To the east you have more land. So place yourself in that world for a moment and understand that these people paid very close attention to their surroundings. They saw the stars, they saw the sun, they saw the moon. With their naked eye, they might be able to see Venus. With their naked eye, they may be, on certain days, be able to see Mars. Right now, some of us are able to see Jupiter and Saturn, because I believe that's what it is, Jupiter and Saturn, because of this convergence right now. So these people saw these things. Okay, they saw that the sun rose in the morning in the east and set in the west. These early peoples that followed and worshipped the land believed that where did the sun go when the day was over? Well, it went to the underworld, of course. Hello, everyone knows that. But when the sun wasn't in the underworld, what did the underworld look like? Well, it was a cold, damp, dark, musty place. For most early pagans, that was how they understood the underworld. This cave-like sort of place. So when the sun went down in the west and the day was over, it was almost like the sun was dying, and then the sun was going to be reborn the next day. So because the sun was dying, the sun was going to the underworld, to this dark, dingy place. And then the sun was coming up in the east the next day, reborn. So the early peoples saw the East as being this sort of place of birth, this place of rebirth, this place of dawn and new beginnings and new day and new chances and new opportunities. And that translated into, that's where the gods live. The gods live over there. That's where they come from. So when they come to alight in this world, when they come to visit this world, they're coming from the East. And when the spirits die, when people die, they go to the underworld and they follow the path of the sun, which is to the west. So they go to the underworld that way. So the underworld is in the west, which is, again, this dark, cold, damp, maybe watery place. Many early pagan traditions and faiths believed that the underworld was a watery place. If you look at I believe it was the Maya, for example, the Maya believed there were 13 realms of the underworld, and of course most of them were dirty, watery places. So the spirits go the way of the sun, and they go to the west, and they follow the sun to the underworld. So you see how the world was sort of set up. You have the sun rising in the east, setting in the west. It's created this sort of worldview. The north is a place of cold and darkness. The south is closer to the equator. It's a place of warmth and light and heat. So for the people that practiced early agrarian nature-based faiths in Northern Europe, this was generally the worldview. Okay? We understand that Wicca, and of course the Wiccan Ritualcraft, comes from Gerald Gardner, who of course was an Englishman who was from England. And this coven of witches that he reportedly found was English. They lived in England. So their environment was very much similar to what I mentioned. Because Wicca was, in a lot of ways, founded and grew during its time in the Northern Hemisphere, this has become the predominant idea. And I didn't think about this until several years ago when I joined the Correllian tradition, and we have practitioners from all over the world, Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. Did I begin to think that things are opposite in the Southern Hemisphere? And this is going to sound incredibly weird. In the Northern Hemisphere, when you flush the toilet, it goes clockwise. In the Southern Hemisphere, when you flush the toilet, it goes counterclockwise. Why? Don't ask me. I just live here. This isn't my life. Okay. So things are a little bit opposite. So in the Southern Hemisphere, the opposite may be true. The North very well may be an area of heat because it's moving toward closer to the equator. And the South may be more of an area of cold because you're going toward the icebergs and, Antarctica. So things may very well be opposite for them. And so their worldview is going to be opposite. And because of that, the wheel of the year, which is not something that's part of this video, is also opposite. It's reversed. So in the Northern Hemisphere, when you have winter, in the Southern Hemisphere, you have summer, because the tilt of the Earth on its axis makes the sun's rays go in whatever direction based upon its location around the sun. So now you have summer, winter, and their opposites. Okay? So the reason I bring this up and the reason I went on that whole tirade about that is because it's important. Because we are recreating our world in ritual based upon our cosmology, based upon our understanding of the world and the universe. But our understanding of the universe and the world is unique to North versus the people that live in the South. So wouldn't you think that their ritual craft would then reflect their experience in the Southern Hemisphere and would thus be slightly different? And the answer is yes. So that is a little bit complex, especially for us that the majority of people that are going to be watching this are probably in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's going to be a little bit different, but suffice to say that there is a difference. And the worldview will be different. And I am grateful to be living in the northern United States, because where I live, I have all 4 seasons. So I can experience the world and be able to use my rituals to connect with the world and each of the seasons. I don't live in Florida or Texas or somewhere where it's hot most of the time and they really don't have other seasons. I live in an area where I have all 4 seasons. So that reflects my ritual and my understanding of ritualcraft. So based upon, let me go back. I've heard, I was in a discussion online with someone one time and they were debating my explanation of the 4 directions. And this particular person said, no, it's based upon the quality of the light. That's where the associations for each of the directions comes from. It has to do with the quality of the light. I don't know this person's source, so I don't know exactly what they were referring to. I have never, in my experience in the last 18 years that I have been studying and practicing Wicca, have I ever heard that. I'm not saying that it's true, I'm not saying that it's false, I'm not saying that it's a bunch of hokum. What I'm saying is that I'm just not familiar with that. So if there's anyone that's watching this video that can enlighten me or educate all of us on what exactly that means, that would be great. But my understanding that's come to me from my research and from the years I've practiced is the story that I gave you. So that understanding and that sort of mythic time of understanding the 4 directions comes into the ritual and comes into the ritual craft and comes into our understanding of the ritual as well. So we have each of the 4 elements. We begin in the east because that's the direction of new day. That's the direction of the dawn. That's the direction of new life and new beginnings. That's the direction of the element of air. And we think about all of the qualities and the associations of the element of air. Again, of thought and intellect and cognition and new beginnings and dawn and rebirth and birth of new ideas. And all of that comes along with the direction of the east because it's associated with the element of air. The direction of the south is the direction of fire, the direction of warmth. But what's associated with warmth? Passion, creativity, love, lust, anger, all of these things that come along with that fire from the direction of the south. The direction of the west is associated with internal things like emotion, intuition, psychism, spirituality, the beloved dead, all of that emotions, all of that comes along with the element of water, all of that watery energy. And then finally the direction of north, the element of earth. The element of earth is associated with stability and integration, and it's associated with this idea of putting things in order and order out of chaos and groundedness and centeredness and home and family and all of that stability that comes along with that earthly energy. So each of these 4 directions is associated with a different element, and by that nature each element is associated with a different quality. So you get these sort of spreadsheets and spreadsheets and spreadsheets of information which are called correspondence, because something corresponds with something else that corresponds with something else, and before you know it, you have this network, this spider work of information. And a lot of people believe that the correspondence were created that way as a way for practitioners to be able to understand something and see the association with things without needing books and books and books and books of things. So it gives us the opportunity to stop and see all of those connections. So we see, for example, the element of east, or I'm sorry, the direction of east is associated with the element of air. The element of air is associated with a certain ritual tool, with a certain color, with a certain stone, with a certain planet, with a certain day of the week, with a certain archangel, with a certain, and it just kind of goes from there. And you have this whole network of associations. The same thing for each of the other directions. So now you have this entire world that's been built upon the associations with each of these things. Each element is associated with an active and a passive quality. When we cast the circle, we call in the quarters. We're calling in all of those associations. We're calling in all of those connections. We're calling in all of those active and passive principles into the circle so that we can utilize that energy in those connections and those associations that I mentioned, if we are aware of it. We need to be fully aware that when I call in the element of air, that I am bringing in with it all of that stuff that I just mentioned. You're bringing in the positive as well as the negative. You're bringing all of that in. You're bringing in that energy. And then you have the opportunity not only to stand at the center of the circle and be surrounded by all of the elements. Each of these elements is bringing their own energy, their own strength, their own protection, but in so doing, you also recreate the world, because we believe in our worldview that the world is created of 5 elements. You, as the 5th element, spirit, stand in the center of the circle, surrounded by all 4 of the other elements, in a place of harmony, in a place of balance, in a place in the world between worlds, where you can work your magic and you can communicate with the gods. So if there are people that want to just go through the motions and say the words and do whatever it is that they feel they need to do in order to just trudge through this part of the ritual, they're missing an entire portion of it because they're not understanding the importance of casting the circle and calling the quarters and inviting in those energies. So I hope that you understand why it's important and why it's such a big deal to invoke the energies. And going back to what I said earlier about words, think what you would say if you were invoking the element. So think about the qualities of the element. Think about what it is maybe that you're trying to invoke. Set that intention and do it. So here's an example. You turn to the direction of the south. You know that south is the element of fire. So you say, "Here do I invoke the element of fire in the direction of the south, the element of creativity and passion and understanding and compassion." I invite you to come into this circle, and I invite you to bring with you your energies of strength and power, and bring your protection into this space. So mote it be. So that is one of many random examples of words that I just kind of pulled out of my hat that I use to set my intention and invoke that direction. So again, the words are not as important as what it is that you're doing. And in our tradition, we use a ritual tool as well to perform the invocation. When casting the circle and using your visualization and your intention, you are creating a spiritual space. Not only are you cutting it apart from the rest, but you're also creating a spiritual barrier. So when using your mind and you're performing that visualization, you're using your mind to create the barrier. And people can create whatever barrier in whatever way it appears to them in their mind that fits the qualities of whatever it is they're trying to do. So if you're invoking the, let me start over. If you are casting the circle and you want the circle to be a strong barrier, what might you in your mind imagine? You may imagine a bubble, or you may imagine a sphere, or you may imagine a wall coming up that acts as a sphere, because it's not just a circle like this. It's a 3-dimensional sphere, and you are in the center of this 3-dimensional sphere of energy that passes above you and below you and around you in a 3-dimensional sphere. So do you imagine it as being like a giant bunch of bricks that kind of just come around you and encase you? Do you imagine it as being just an energetic barrier of some kind of color, whatever color to you means protection or balance. Most people it's white or like an electric blue. What is it that you see in your mind's eye that's going to reinforce your intention in the words that you're speaking to do what it is that you're trying to do? And so when you call the quarters, the same thing is true. What are you going to visualize in your mind that's going to support or encourage this understanding of bringing in those energies, bringing in that quality? In ceremonial traditions, they would use the drawing of an invoking pentagram. The invoking pentagram is a pentagram that it's the geometric 5-pointed star shape that you draw in the air in a very particular prescribed way that is used only for invocation, and you draw it and invoke in, pull in those energies. Some people will envision that they have created a sort of energy construct that has sort of been built as the energy comes in. It sort of creates this sort of, I don't want to say elephant in the room, but it's almost like you've kind of created this energy construct that you bring in, and you just sit down in the circle and say, this is now the element of air, and here it is constantly bringing its energies in. So whatever it is, some people might see a curtain and they part the curtain, and it's like opening a window, and they just bring it in, they just let it flow. Whatever it is that you need in order to reinforce that understanding and that belief of being able to pull that energy in and seat it in your circle to do whatever it is that you want it to do, which in this case would be recreating the cosmos, bringing to the sacred space balance and wholeness. So we go around our space, we begin in the east, and we move, we're invoking, so what direction do we move in? Josel. Clockwise. So we begin in the east, we move clockwise around the circle until we get back to east again, and we go and we invoke each quarter in turn. So we invoke each of the quarters with whatever words we choose to use. Sometimes the words can be more or less poetic or more or less dramatic, depending on who you are, and maybe even depending upon what the occasion is. If it is a holiday, you may choose to kind of spice it up a little bit and to use more poetic language. If you're just having a basic ritual and you want to invoke the quarters, you may just use basic language like the invocation I provided here. So it all just depends on you, and it depends on what it is that you want to do and how you choose to do it, and what your intention is. We go back to that because intention and will is one of the most important pieces of the puzzle that is Ritualcraft. So we need to know what our intention is. What are you trying to do? What do you mean to do? And set that intention. And do that intention. And I'll probably say it 1,000 more times in this video. So, at this point, we've created our sacred space. We've cut it out separate from the rest of the universe. We've created a time in between time by casting our magic circle. We've created a space of harmony and strength and protection and power by invoking the quarters. Now, at this point, we go ahead and we invite the deities to come into our space. These deities are spirits that we have chosen to work with. Maybe they are simply understood as the god and the goddess, lord and lady. Maybe they are very specific to our practice and to our tradition. If you talk about, for instance, CX Wicca, which is the tradition that Raymond Buckland started, he uses the term Woden and Freya. Those are the names that he's chosen in his tradition to ascribe to the deities. So when you invoke them, you would use those words. there is a nuance, because in some traditions they require practitioners to use the names and personalities and understandings of the tradition's deities when in groups. However, when practicing alone, the individual is open to invoke whatever deity they want. I am not of the school that you just invoke whatever deity you want whenever you need a specific thing. Like, oh, well, my Book of Shadows says that Zeus is the god of order, so I'm doing this spell for stability in my life and order and, you know, being pulled out of chaos, so I'm going to invoke Zeus. I have no relationship with Zeus whatsoever. I really don't know anything about him. I don't know his myths. I don't know his stories. I don't know his temperament. But I'm going to go ahead and invoke him anyway, because that's just what I do. I'm not really of the school that says that you do that, but to each their own at this point. I approach my deities as being the god and the goddess, and the goddess has aspects of all goddesses, and the god has all aspects of all the gods. So with that being said, my goddess has the capability of doing anything. My god has the capability of doing anything. So for me, I don't necessarily need to invoke a specific name or a specific personality of a specific deity in order to get what I need, or in order to invoke a deity that I feel needs to be involved in this situation. Now, the Four Pillars Proto-Temple has Gaia as our patron deity, so maybe I will lean on Gaia more so than any other deity, but suffice to say that, again, all of my gods and goddesses can do anything, so I can call on either the god or the goddess without calling on a specific deity to do that. And I feel in a lot of ways it's very disrespectful to find some random, it would be like walking down the street and being like, hey, you. Yeah, you right there. I don't know your name, you in the hat. I don't know who you are, but hey, can I have $50 for whatever? They're gonna be like, no, get out of here. The same thing with the gods. If you have no relationship with them, how can you possibly think it's a respectful, at the very least, a respectful idea to just be like, hey, listen, I want to do this. I want you to do this for me. So anyway, like I said, that's up to you, but that's not really the school of thought that I come from. So understand that when you're invoking deities, that you use... I'm sorry, give me just a second. This battery's almost dead. I just wanted to make sure I had another one. When you call upon the deities and you're using them in your work, understand that having a relationship is going to make them more willing to help you. Now, there is a prevailing thought, going back to the Norse tradition, because I've mentioned it already, that in the Norse tradition, in order to get something, you have to give something, and it's a very, very specific practice in the Norse tradition. And so I would assume then that people that are inspired by the Norse pantheon would also understand that, because that is part of the early Norse people's understanding of hospitality. You give a gift to your guest, they give a gift in return. That's the way that it is, and that's the way it should be. So if you're working with the Norse pantheon, you need to understand that. Just like with other pantheons, if you're choosing to work with them, you need to understand that. So you can't just look through a book and call up some random spirit or being and say, hey, listen, help me out here. It doesn't work that way. At least not in my book. Anyway, I think I've made my point. So when we choose to invoke the deities, we need to figure out who it is that we're going to invoke. After we've figured out who it is we're going to invoke, we need to understand that when we call upon them, they are going to enter our magic circle, and they are going to be here of their own volition. If they choose not to come, that's on them. If they choose to leave early, hey, maybe it wasn't a fun party. But that's up to them. So for me, what I like to do is I like to use a sort of mechanism that is a visual reminder for me that the spirits are there, or that they've come. So On my altar before each of my deity statues, I have a candle. And when I perform the invocation, I light that candle. That is a physicalization of the words. So not only am I speaking my intention, I'm also doing a physical act, which is tying the two together, and I'm also performing a visualization where the spirit of that being then descends upon the altar or descends in the circle. And that's a really important part. So in addition to just having the intention that they come, you want to see them come. You want to see them come in. So be mindful of how important that is. So let's say, for example, I am invoking the god Crononus. Now, of course, we know the god Crononus is a Celtic deity. He's also been viewed by paganism in general as sort of being this spirit of the forest, this spirit of wild animals, this spirit of, sometimes he's a guide. He guides us through the forest, through the thicket, through the deep, dense woods. He also is familiar with the other world. He can sometimes be depicted as like a sorcerer, like where he is familiar with the other world and familiar with things that are going on and familiar with sort of the spirit realm. So knowing all that I know about Crononus, I formulate an invocation, an incantation. I'm inviting him into my space, I'm using my words, I'm setting my intention. I can say something to the effect of, Hail Crononus, Lord of the green wood, Lord of the wild animals, Lord of the dense, deep forests, shepherd and guide. Lord Crononus, I invite you now into this space, and I ask for your blessings upon the work that I am doing. Grant me your presence, sacred Lord. Hail and welcome. Again, I just made that up. That's not an invocation that I use often. I do have a statue of Crononus on my shrine, but I don't invoke him in that way a lot. But again, I just made it up because I set my intention. Again, I thought of what it is I really wanted to happen. I made it happen. There it is. All done. So we invoke the gods. And everybody is different. Some people may only invoke their patron, maybe if they only have one patron. When I perform high ritual, especially Sabbat ritual, I feel that it is balanced and it is only fair and respectful to invoke both God and Goddess, because especially when we're observing the holidays, we understand that both God and Goddess normally play some sort of a part. On Samhain, the Lord becomes the Lord of Death, the Goddess becomes the Lady of life, and of course she then mourns the loss of her lover, who is the Lord of Death, who then goes to the underworld and is reborn again at Yule. Or we we see her at Beltane, when both God and Goddess come together and create sacred marriage, where they have this sacred union that is important, which populates the entire world and creates the spirits and creates the peak of creation, is at the peak of creation. So normally both God and Goddess are involved in some fashion. So because they're both involved in some fashion, I like to invoke them both. Again, if you're doing a specific working, you may only choose to invoke one of them. If you have a patron and you work with that patron primarily above all else, then you might only invoke that one patron. It's really up to you. In some traditions, they also choose to invoke the ancestors. The Carillion tradition is a tradition that was originally a family tradition, which then opened to the public. So as a family tradition, there was a very strong emphasis on family, and thus on the ancestors that went before us, that taught us how to live our lives. And because of that, there is a heavy influence of ancestor worship and emphasis on ancestor invocation. So you may choose at this point, after invoking the God and Goddess, to invoke the ancestors. Some traditions might not really have any involvement in the ancestors, and so you may choose not to. Or maybe you personally absolutely hate your family and you were disowned because you were a Wiccan. So you're like, screw my family, I'm not going to invoke anybody. That's up to you. That's your choice. But this is the part in the ritual when you would then invoke the ancestors. And you would say, again, a similar invocation based upon your intent, what it is that you want to do, what you're trying to do, and you set your intention and you speak your invocation, whatever it is that you want to use. And you may choose to have a standard invocation you use every time. And as part of ritual, and going back to the first segment when we talked about how humans are ritualistic and routine and habitual creatures, sometimes it's good to have words that you repeat over and over and over and over and over again, because it sets you in that mythic place and sets you in that time. I am more spontaneous, so I just speak from my heart. I don't always use ritual that is repetitive, but if you feel that you want to use pre-written words for yourself, then absolutely, by all means, go ahead and do it. So at this point, to recap all the way from the beginning, we talked about creating our sacred space. We talked about the importance of going in certain directions, whether it be Josel or Tuathal. We talked about casting the magic circle and calling the quarters. We talked about invoking the deities. So at this point, we've gotten all the way through all of our preliminary ritual rites. They're called rites. They're like small rituals, like little segments. So we've gotten through all of our preliminary rites, and now we are at the portion of the ritual where we're actually going to do the worship, or we're actually going to do the magic. So stay tuned for this next segment of this video, and we go ahead and talk about that.